Boa noite a todas e todos. Eu peço licença para cumprimentar a nossa convidada, a professora Gretchen Helmke, e eu retorno com as considerações iniciais devidas em português, antes de facultar a palavra à conferencista da noite. Good evening, Professor Gretchen Helmke. I'll start speaking in Portuguese for our audience convenience, and then, if you don't mind, I'll direct you the proper thanks and give you the floor, okay? Então, dando início à atividade programada para as 19 horas de hoje, eu inicio apresentando a conferencista da noite, professora Gretchen Helmke, que muito gentilmente aceitou o convite da Associação Brasileira de Ciência Política para participar desse nosso 13º Encontro Nacional. A professora Gretchen Helmke é doutora em Ciência Política pela Universidade de Chicago. Ela é professora associada de Ciência Política da Universidade de Rochester. E ela é membro fundadora da Bright Line Watch, que é uma organização não partidária de acadêmicos, de scholars, que monitoram as ameaças à democracia nos Estados Unidos. Ela já lecionou na Universidade de Notre Dame e recebeu também fellowships do Kellogg Institute for International Studies, da Universidade de Notre Dame, Waterhead Center, da Harvard University, e Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. A sua agenda de pesquisa se concentra basicamente em instituições políticas, judicial politics and the rule of law, instituições informais e normas e erosão democrática na América Latina e nos Estados Unidos. Ela tem uma vasta publicação, alguns dos seus principais livros são Institutions on the Edge, foi publicado, editado pela Cambridge University Press, Courts in Latin America, coeditado com Julio Rios Figueroa, também pela Cambridge University Press, Courts Under Constraints, também pela Cambridge University Press, e Informal Institutions and Democracy, esse coeditado com Stephen Levitz, que saiu pela Johns Hopkins University Press. Também tem artigos publicados nas mais prestigiadas revistas internacionais, como American Political Science Review, Journal of Politics, British Journal of Political Science, Journal of Law and Courts, Comparative Politics e muitas outras. Ela atualmente trabalha no projeto de um livro intitulado provisoriamente Impending Impunity, Corruption, Competition and Selective Accountability Under Democracy. Nessa obra, a partir de experiências de sistemas presidencialistas em todo o mundo, a autora e conferencista da noite busca avaliar os fatores políticos subjacentes à acusação de líderes democraticamente eleitos por corrupção, e analisa os trade-offs que esses processos envolvem, que essas dinâmicas envolvem em face da democracia e do Estado de Direito nos Estados Unidos, mas também para além das fronteiras estadunidenses. Hoje, a professora Gretchen Helmke vai nos falar um pouco sobre accountability e erosão democrática nas Américas. Sem mais delongas, portanto, eu vou encaminhar os nossos agradecimentos à conferencista e passarei a ela a palavra. Lembro a todas e a todos, por fim, que há tradução simultânea disponível. Professor Helmke, welcome to the 13th Brazilian Political Science Association meeting. In place of the Brazilian political scientist community, I thank you for your readiness in accepting our invitation to take part of the activities of this year's meeting as one of our keynote speakers. It is therefore with great joy that I give you the floor so that you can carry on with your conference on accountability and democratic erosion in the Americas. You have approximately 45 minutes for your presentation. You can, if you want, share your screen. Be my guest, yes, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you here. I'm so grateful for the invitation. And I actually had the pleasure of meeting Marjorie in person last week at the American Political Science Association in Montreal. But it's really just a delight to be with all of you here today, even if it's over Zoom. So let me share my screen here. Right. Okay. All right. So the title of my talk today is Accountability and Democratic Erosion in the Americas. And I want to start off with just a very basic observation about democracy, which is that accountability is absolutely fundamental to the functioning of liberal democracy. So if we think about drawing on work by the political scientist Guillermo O'Donnell, we can think of accountability as operating on two levels. So at the electoral level, it functions whenever voters are willing and able to punish leaders who transgress laws and violate basic norms. And this is what O'Donnell has referred to as vertical accountability. The other kind of accountability operates more at the institutional level, and it functions whenever political elites are willing and able to punish leaders who undermine the rule of law or the spirit of the law. And this is what he referred to as horizontal accountability. And it basically captures how well checks and balances are operating across the different branches of government. So we can certainly usefully conceptualize and analyze these as separate types of accountability. But what I want to argue today is that each must constantly serve to reinforce the other if liberal democracy is going to survive and thrive. Now, unfortunately, across much of contemporary Latin America.
Excuse me, Professor Helm.
Yes.
We are stuck in the first slide. I think that they are not passing.
Oh, I haven't moved forward yet.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. No problem. All right. Across contemporary Latin America and the United States, both vertical and horizontal accountability are at risk. Indeed, I would argue that the hallmark feature of democratic erosion around the world today is that voters and political elites alike are able, but nevertheless unwilling, to punish transgressions against the rule of law made by would-be autocratic leaders. And the longer such unwillingness persists, the more that this choice of resistance may disappear and may make it more likely that it's going to give way to a thoroughgoing authoritarianism. Thus, to the extent that the identification of threats of erosion and early acts of resistance are possible, they are essential pieces of the puzzle in reversing the process of democratic backsliding. So in my talk today, I want to illustrate some of these broader points by briefly summarizing a couple of areas of research that I have been working on. Now, as Marjorie mentioned, a lot of my research throughout my career has been focused on Latin America, but over the last few years, I've been focusing as well on the United States. And most of the work that I'm going to share today is focused on the United States, but I think has interesting applications to Latin America. So the first piece of research that I want to present builds on some of the survey work that I've been doing for the last few years with a group of scholars at Brightline Watch, which is an organization that I formed with other scholars at Dartmouth and the University of Chicago to monitor the health of democracy, and which routinely polls both political science experts in the United States as well as the public. So the core finding of our research there is that in the contemporary United States, perceptions are so deeply polarized by political party that it's virtually impossible for voters to agree when a politician is transgressing the rule of law. So as we know from theoretical work done by Barry Weingast and other scholars, the main reason that this matters is that it essentially leaves a ruler able to abuse their power with any consequences, right? With any loss of support among their own followers. And note that this is not because the followers don't share a commitment to basic democratic values, which I'll show some slides on in just a minute, but it's because they don't see these values as being compromised by the leader in the first place. So then in the second part of the talk, I want to switch the focus to exploring some of my research on pushback by political elites and how this might provide a kind of catalyst for a coordination of voters' perceptions, and perhaps a way out of this type of polarization and accountability failure. So specifically, I want to focus on some of the preliminary results from a survey experiment that researchers at the University of Rochester and I did on norm violations during the Trump presidency, where we found that bipartisan pushback against some of Trump's norm-breaking violations did in fact move the needle for his supporters. So before I get to either of those two strands of research, let me just start with some of the broad patterns of democratic erosion globally, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. So this map is taken from a recent report from the VDEM project and provides, I think, a very clear snapshot of countries that have experienced substantial change on their liberal democracy index. And that index includes everything from free and fair elections, to constraints on executive power, to different rule of law measures, to individual rights and liberties. So the countries in gray, as you probably already surmised, right, those represent a mix of both democracies and dictatorships. Those simply, though, are the countries where there hasn't really been substantial change over the last decade. The countries in green or light green are sort of the the excellent cases. These are cases where democracy has been improving over the last 10 years. The big takeaway, though, are the cases in yellow and in orange. These are the countries where there has been substantial democratic backsliding. And these, of course, include some of the world's largest populations. So we see on the map the United States, Brazil, India, as well as several states in Eastern Europe and Turkey. So just to give sort of an additional sense of trends here, the sort of most discouraging thing is that, electoral autocracies now are the most common type of regime in the world, and the number of liberal democracies has really declined substantially in the last decade, right? And the number of the total number of those liberal democracies is back to about 1989 levels. So taken together, these trends have unleashed, sorry, I'm moving some things around on my slides here. They have unleashed a burgeoning literature, both popular literature as well as academic literature, about the dynamics of democratic erosion. So the most well-known contribution that I want to call out here, just because it's had such influence on my thinking, on the thinking of the discipline, is the book by Stephen Levitsky and Dan Ziblatt, How Democracies Die. And I think the virtue of this book is that it really paints us a roadmap for how to identify when democratic erosion is occurring. And there are basically three sort of key features that jump out here. So the first main feature of erosion in the contemporary period is that it occurs piecemeal and is gradual, right? It doesn't just happen all at once. So this contrasts sharply with how democracies tended to die during the 20th century, which was usually at the hands of a military coup and a very rapid, clear break with electoral democracy. Now, from the standpoint of accountability, this kind of slow death makes it especially hard for opponents to push back, right? There's no single event often around which voters or politicians can coordinate. And there is sort of a danger of exhausting the so-called cycle of mobilization before it even really gets a chance to take off. So in light of some of the earlier theoretical work on the dynamics of regime transitions in democracy, I think this feature of democratic backsliding provides a particularly rich area for modeling and theorizing that is really only beginning to be tapped. So the second feature of how democracies die these days is that they're dying at the hands of popularly elected executives or presidents who are attacking democracy basically in the name of representing the real people. And they often for much of their rule, retain a lot of popular support. The third feature of this is that there is, I guess, what has been kind of called a playbook, where these elected popular leaders are using the rule of law or using existing institutions in order to subvert the existing democracy or the rule of law, right? So they're weaponizing institutions in order to bolster their own power and to eliminate their opponents. So there is a lot of really interesting variation within this general strategy across countries. And in some of the recent work that I've done with my colleagues Jack Payne and Mary Kroger, we've looked specifically at how patterns of demographic partisan sorting in the United States have kind of mapped on to some of the counter-majoritarian features that have been long-standing in the United States Constitution, but in combination with these demographic sorting patterns have really undermined basic norms of forbearance in the United States. Some of the effects have been purely mechanical, but others have been manipulated by leaders, particularly Republican leaders. And I think generally understanding the ways in which autocrats can use existing institutions to secure themselves in power is, again, a really rich source of ongoing research. So let me now turn to some of the polling that we've been doing at Brightline Watch about perceptions of democracy in the United States. So over the last 5 years, we've been conducting regular public and expert polling on approximately 30 democratic principles. And let me just start with a slide that gives you a sense of how important the public views these different principles by party, right? So here, instead of having Republican and Democratic supporters, the blue supporters are Trump disapprovers, the red supporters are Trump approvers. So we just have it disaggregated by Trump approval as opposed to party, but it's essentially the same, the same difference. So there are multiple different types of principles that we're polling on. A lot of these build on some of the basic guarantees that are familiar to anyone who has read Robert Dahl's work on institutional guarantees for free and fair elections. But some of the other principles are also related to the rule of law, to corruption, and even in some cases to public discourse. So the big punchline that comes out of this poll, right, is essentially how much agreement there still is across party lines among voters about which principles matter most, right? So there are a few sort of worrying exceptions. So for example, I'll call out political violence here, right? There is pretty big partisan gap with Republicans or Trump approvers not thinking that it is as important for a functioning democracy. Having no political violence is as crucial for a democracy as Trump opponents. Likewise, and I'll get to this in just a second, right, the norm of the candidate who loses conceding defeat, right, big partisan gap there. But generally, right, the majority of respondents in both parties tend to agree that all of these principles are really important for a democracy. Now, where we can see the polarization of perceptions really starkly is when we start to ask questions about how well these principles are performing in practice and whether the United States is sort of living up to these principles. And here we have some really stark divisions by party. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the one that really jumps out to me, which is also the principle that gets sort of the most support in terms of being important, is the polarization over whether the United States has fraud-free elections or not. And here we can see this is a more specific version of that question that we have asked multiple times since the 2020 elections. and that is whether Biden was indeed the rightful winner of the election, right? And there are sort of, I think, two takeaways from this slide. The first is that obviously there's a huge, and other polling agencies have also documented this, there is a huge discrepancy between Democrats and Republicans, right? 97% to 27%. So giant partisan gap. But the other thing that I really want to highlight that sometimes gets overlooked is just how stable that division has been over time, right? So this suggests that once perceptions over something are polarized, it's very hard to change them. And of course, from an accountability perspective, this undermines the ability of citizens to converge on any kind of deterrence or punishment strategy for leaders who are seeking to undermine the rule of law. So again, with the 2020 election, the problem was not just confidence in Biden himself, but confidence going forward in the basic legitimacy of elections and faith in the process itself. So in our survey last year, right, overall 62% of Americans said that they were confident that their votes would be counted as intended in the upcoming midterm elections that are going to take place here in a couple of months. But again, we see this huge partisan gap between Democrats and Republicans. It's worth pausing for a minute just to compare these results with some of the recent polling that I have seen on trust in the electoral process in Brazil. So over the last year, Bolsonaro, like Trump, has made a series of claims seeking to undermine confidence in the voting system. But at least according to the polls that I've seen, these claims have not gotten nearly as much traction as they have in the United States, which I think is probably a topic that many of you are thinking about, explaining that and understanding that. Of course, these data are also not broken out by party, so that would be especially interesting to look at as well. All right, so in addition to some of the data that I've shown you on polarization over performance, I also want to share with you a study that we recently did on partisan misperceptions. And this is building on research carried out by other scholars. And we are sort of running a similar battery of question. But basically what we did is we took the responses that we've had on, whether if you're a Democrat or Republican, you think that various norms are important to you. And then we asked people in our sample how important they thought those norms were, both to their co-partisans, but also to people from the other party. And we have a couple of different, 4 different questions here, but again, I'll just focus on fraud-free elections. So among Democrats, right, the actual estimate is right here. So about 90% of Democrats think that fraud-free elections are important. They think that their co-partisans, slightly less, but they think that their co-partisans also think that elections are important, but they think that only about 60, a little less than 60% of Republicans think that elections are important. And we have an even bigger gap here for Republican respondents, right? They actually underestimate the amount to which their own co-partisans rank the value of fraud-free elections, but they wildly underestimate the commitment of Democrats to elections. So we got these as sort of baseline measures. And then what we did is we basically developed a kind of randomization where some of the people randomly selected, they had their misperceptions corrected, right? We gave them actual information about how Democrats and how their co-partisans or Republicans responded to these questions. And then what we tried to see is what's the difference between the group that hasn't received any correct information about how different voters rank these values versus people who have had their misperceptions corrected. And in an ideal world, correcting misperceptions would have a big effect on people's willingness to support these sorts of hardball tactics, right? So there are a variety they looked at, but so for example, one was redrawing districts to maximize their win, even if it's illegal, right? This is the control group. So these are voters who, still had those misperceptions about the other party, and this is the treatment group, right? So the misperceptions were corrected. If correcting misperceptions mattered, you should see this drop significantly. But in each of these cases, right, there are minute differences that emerge from correcting misperceptions, but nothing that significant, which is sobering. So let me sort of shift course from looking just at how voters are responding and talk a little bit about some of the research that we've been doing on political pushback by party elites. All right, so we know from a lot of the media reports that the Republicans have been doing very little to correct misperceptions about the 2020 election. So just as there was sort of a failure of gatekeeping in the 2016 primaries, there has been essentially very little pushback by Republican Party leaders against some of the most egregious anti-democratic actions taken by Trump. So, for example, last spring, a book from New York Times journalists based on audio recordings showed that both Mitch McConnell, who's the head of the Senate, and Speaker McCarthy were initially following the January 6th attack on the Capitol, very committed to getting Trump out of office and distancing the Republican. For example, McCarthy was recorded as saying to the Republican leadership that, quote unquote, what he did is unacceptable. Nobody can defend that and nobody should defend it. Yet within days, the party leadership fell back in line, and McCarthy currently denies ever having made such statements. So we know from this and countless other examples that Republicans, with some notable exceptions like Liz Cheney, did not push back during the administration and aren't really pushing back now. So the sort of million-dollar question that remains out there is this: if Republicans had pushed back more, would this have made much of a difference to Trump supporters? Could it have changed voters' minds? And were there any moments in the Trump presidency where pushback could have created more doubts about the appropriateness of Trump's behavior? And would this have necessarily hurt the Republican Party? So these are some of the basic questions that we're trying to get out with the survey experiment that we conducted in the final months of the Trump administration, and which considers how both partisan and bipartisan pushback against President Trump would have affected public assessment of Trump and of the two parties. So in designing our study, we were motivated by a number of different types of literature. So some of that is the democratic erosion literature that I've already mentioned, the idea that norms matter, attributed to Levitsky and Ziblatt. Also, excellent work done on experiments of norms, particularly by Spolek and Graham, as well as others. In addition, though, to this work on democratic erosion, we also wanted to draw from some of the literature within the United States on presidential unilateralism. And even though the democratic erosion literature is pretty pessimistic in terms of thinking that elites could do anything to change voters' perceptions, this literature on presidential unilateralism, often applied to just policy areas, war decisions, things like that, does suggest that the public is very susceptible to elite cues. And finally, we look at a third kind of literature that is inspired more by game theory and signaling models that basically recognizes that there is sort of this embedded information problem where co-partisans of the president always have an incentive to downplay any violations that are taking place. Opposition politicians always have an incentive to blow things out of proportion. And so voters are sort of caught in the middle of these two things. And the only kind of signal in these kinds of games, the only kind of signal that contains any information is if both parties come together to basically either cast blame on the leader or declare his innocence. So bringing all of these literatures together, we basically came up with a series of pre-registered hypotheses about how different types of pushback, either partisan or bipartisan pushback, might affect voters' perceptions about presidential norm violation. So the first one, a bipartisan reinforcement hypothesis, is that when you have both parties coming together to criticize the president, this is going to decrease the positive perceptions of the president. Partisan backlash, that partisan pushback could actually create a backlash effect where everybody actually updates positively on the president. And finally, an alternative conventional partisan reinforcement, which is that positive partisan pushback decreases positive perceptions of the president's actions among all voters. We also embedded questions about how these kinds of pushback might affect parties' reputations. So the first one is that partisan pushback would decrease positive perceptions of both parties, right? Both have incentives to lie. The second one would be that bipartisan pushback increases positive perceptions of both parties. All right, so just very quickly to talk about the survey experiment that we ran, we were thinking about trying to identify one of the many hundreds of norm violations that occurred during Trump's presidency. And essentially, we wanted to find a norm violation that satisfied two potentially competing criteria. So on the one hand, we wanted to select an event that had elicited both partisan and co-partisan pushback. But we also wanted to avoid choosing a norm that was so highly publicized and salient that respondents would have already fully made up their minds about it, thus making it impossible to detect any observable treatment effects. So you can think about something like the 2020 election as being such a salient event that any kind of survey experiment is probably not going to have any kind of effect on how voters are updating their information. So the norm that we ended up choosing was Trump's decision to fire the Inspector General, one of the Inspector Generals in the United States, Michael Atkinson. Atkinson, for some of you news junkies who follow US politics, was the person who had alerted Congress of the whistleblower complaint that led to Trump's first impeachment over Ukraine. So really importantly for our purposes, Trump did have the legal authority to fire the Inspector General, right? They are officially executive appointees. They serve at the pleasure of the president. But in the decades since these watchdog positions were created, the norm has been that presidents respect the independence of these officials. So in the last year of his presidency, Trump shattered this norm and he ended up actually firing a total of 5 inspectors general. What we do is we basically use that example and we came up with an experimental design where we're varying the political pushback. So we ran an online survey experiment during a couple of years ago in September of 2020. This was also during the pandemic. We used a series of screening questions to get a balanced sample, and then we just used a standard between subjects design. And so kind of to give you a flavor of this survey, the control text that all of the respondents received was just basic information about the firing of Michael Atkinson, and also clearly saying that Trump has the authority to fire presidential opponents, but that past presidents have never fired an inspector general. So signaling clearly that it was a norm violation, not a legal violation. Then in the partisan treatment text, the respondents see the story again of Michael Atkinson, but then they see two different criticisms by Democratic members about how important this violation was. And then in the bipartisan treatment text, they get criticism from both Democrats and Republicans. All right. So then after going through that, we then ask a series of outcome variable questions. How much trust or accuracy? Oops, I think I missed the first one. First one were the outcome variables for President Trump. How appropriate do you think it was to fire him? How important was it? And how much respect do you think he has for the country's democratic institutions and traditions? And then in addition, we also had outcome variables for the two parties. So how much do you trust the accuracy of information that you get about the government from Democrats and Republicans? And how much confidence do you have in these two parties? Basically, we had two sort of main findings that came out of this. So the first one is essentially a lot of null results. But the kind of key takeaway from this is the partisan treatment, right, which is delineated by all of the graphs with the dots on them. Partisan has absolutely no effect, right? So this kind of pushback, as you would think from a kind of signaling model, is completely pointless in the sense that it has no demonstrable effect on public perceptions of norm violations at all. So Republicans identifying as either Democrat or Republican remained heavily polarized, and they were also wholly unswayed by criticism of the former president's actions whenever it was leveled solely by Democratic legislators. The big news, though, is this particular finding here, right? And this is basically showing that the bipartisan treatment compared to the control group does make a difference for Republican respondents, right? It shows that bipartisan legislative pushback does effectively undermine public support for the president's norm-busting actions, specifically among Republican respondents. Note, though, that this effect is confined solely to the appropriateness of Trump's actions. It does nothing to change voters' views on whether he respects the rule of law or how important it is. So it's a very it's a confined finding. The other sort of interesting finding, and I'll end here before just wrapping up with a concluding slide, is the effects of pushback on respondents' views about political parties. And, you know, the conventional wisdom is that the Republican Party, had they stood up to Trump, would be punished by voters for doing that. And what we actually find is that there really are no punishment effects, at least from, you know, in this particular experiment. And if anything, trust in the Republican Party by Democratic voters actually increases as a result of the bipartisan pushback. Now, that does not mean that individual legislators within the Republican Party do not suffer consequences. So I really want to emphasize this. I want to highlight the fact that these are questions pertaining to overall confidence and trust in the parties, right? It's clearly the case, and we see this in a lot of the primaries, that there is a clear cost for individual legislators. And so to the extent that pushback is effective in changing people's perceptions, it then just creates another problem of collective action on part of elites in terms of who is willing to sort of fall on the sword and bear this cost. And obviously, very few politicians are. So just to wrap up here, I want to end with a couple of different broad points. So I began the talk by talking about two different kinds of accountability. And I think, both types depend on each other, but what I've tried to show in this talk is that to the extent that vertical accountability can be cultivated at all, right, it requires misperceptions being corrected, and that we have some preliminary evidence to suggest that that depends on horizontal accountability, and particularly on elites being willing to step up. Vertical accountability, in the first part of my talk, I also want to underscore, right, it requires common perceptions about performance and about action. It's not just about common values, right? That is not enough to create vertical accountability. I also think that the talk has suggested, on the one hand, that citizens' political perceptions, once they're formed, they may be hard to change, right? We certainly see that with the 2020 election and with the continuation of the big lie. But with the experimental evidence that we've suggested, it also seems that perceptions are not immutable. Now, maybe that's confined to, again, to events that are not as broadly publicized as something like the 2020 election. And then the final point here is that horizontal accountability as political elite pushback can make a difference. The key question then is how exactly to incentivize such pushback, not just across parties, but within parties. And I will end it here. Thank you so much for inviting me and for listening today.
Thank you, Professor Helm. It was great to hear from you about a topic as current as one you address in your lecture. Your reflections dialogue directly with the Brazilian political context. And I sincerely hope that this opportunity we had here will be a model for the development of research projects in the field in many of our great universities and research centers. So thank you again. And I will ask permission to say goodbye to our audience in Portuguese so that we can finish the activity now. Pessoal, eu agradeço então a todas e todos. Convido a vocês a continuarem atentos à programação de amanhã, que é o nosso último dia desse encontro. Para os sócios, nós temos a Assembleia Geral marcada amanhã para as 15 horas. Então, obrigado mais uma vez pela audiência. Thank you again, Professor Helm. Boa noite.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.